Welcome to Bottom Up Intelligence Analysis, Part 1. So today we're going to be discussing intelligence analysis on the ground, cognitive processing, models of cognition, and ontology of arguments. Now, I'm saying intelligence analysis on the ground. If you recall, we've been discussing intelligence analysis in the air, as it were, from a top-down perspective. And a central conceit in the ontology engineering strategies that I deploy and encourage people to deploy is that we both go from the top down and the bottom up in what I like to call a middle in strategy, or for those of you more militarily inclined, a pincer movement, where you are basically working with data or working on the ground with how things are with an eye towards an upper level structure like BFO or Common Core. So now we're less up in the aether in the realm of the forms with continuance and whatnot. We're going to be focused more on things that you see in the realm of dry goods, as they say, like tables and chairs, but more specifically, cognition, something you live with all the time. But before we get there, we should jump back to our characterization of intelligence. If you recall, we discussed this in some of the earlier lectures. We haven't really circled back, but now that we're getting back onto the ground, it behooves us to discuss this more earnestly. So we'll revisit just for a moment, just to remind you, when we're aiming towards precise definitions, and specifically of intelligence here, what we're trying to do is come up with something that's broad enough to cover specializations of intelligence, like military or criminal intelligence, but not so broad as to include every use of intelligence in natural language. Like that was an intelligent defense. It's not the sort of intelligence that we're specifically after here. Another reminder as for definition construction, I'll move through this quickly, but if you have something defined, like some T and an expression defining it, the definition itself is an ordered pair. And for any definition in any domain, T is going to be true in that domain just in case E is. That is to say, if T is true, then E is true. And if E is true, and T is true, which gives you an insight into how to test these things. First, you assume T is true, and then you try to come up with a way for E to be false. If you can do that, you got to fix your definition. Similarly, if you start with E being true and you find a way for T to be false, you got to fix your definition. Because good definitions are such that, again, if T is true, then E is true. If E is true, then T is true. Triangle is a good example of a good definition. You're not going to come up with a counterexample, we call it. You're not going to find a scenario in which something's a triangle that's not a polygon with 3 edges and 3 vertices, and vice versa. You're not going to find a polygon with 3 edges and 3 vertices that's not a triangle. Okay, keep this in mind as we explore and get a little clearer on what intelligence is in the sense that we're intending to capture here. So I'm pulling from some literature that I thought was quite good, at least aiming in the right direction. So from the scientific methods of inquiry for intelligence analysis, you see information is described as an unrefined raw material used to produce finished and focused intelligence. So clearly here, there's a distinction between information on the one hand and intelligence on the other. It should make sense, right? Intelligence, as we've been discussing, as something like an output of a cycle of vetting and investigation, right? But what is it taking? What's being taken into that cycle? Information, patterns that are about stuff, represented in various ontologies, or a couple at least, as information content entities that bear some about relationship. Epistemic communities, as a reminder, we've discussed this a couple of times. Groups like intelligence agencies. Essentially, they have normative beliefs about the purposes of their actions. These beliefs are based on experiences, investigating central problems, etc., and standards of accuracy for analyzing or the analysis that's conducted in their field, as well as common community goals. Epistemic communities. You see these all over the place. You got examples here of like the NSA, but also research communities are like this. Like think tanks are like this. They would count as epistemic communities. Some Reddit forums are like this. Most are not, but some of them are. Question that naturally comes up, at least it did to me. What is the distinction between evidence, if there is one, between evidence and information? So we see there's a line to draw between information and intelligence. Evidence seems to go on here, right? Epistemic communities are often looking for evidence. It seems like intelligence agencies are also looking for evidence of this or that. What is the distinction here? I'll put it to you that evidence is a type of information which may support or provide justification for some beliefs. The support or provide justification component we'll discuss near the end of today, where we talk about arguments, because justification and support are all in the context of persuasion and argumentation. So we'll end on that note. Before we get there, I also want to point out that evidence can also be used, as often is used, to rebut or undercut beliefs. So not just justify, but undercut or rebut. And remember, what is that? Well, these are types of defeaters. You can characterize them as types of defeaters, like rebutting defeaters or undercutting defeaters. There's like two ways to demonstrate that something's false, or at least provide evidence that something's false. If you have some proposition P, you can rebut it by giving evidence that something is that not P is true. You can undercut it, on the other hand, by giving reason to think that P is not true without giving evidence that not P is true. Are you familiar with disputes between theists and atheists and agnostic individuals? You see, there's like a tripartite divide. You can map this on to the rebutting and undercutting. So saying that theism is false doesn't necessarily mean that atheism is true. You may have a middle ground in which you have undercut belief in theism and left yourself in an agnostic position because you do not have evidence to go that extra mile and say that, oh no, there is no deity. Does that make sense? Defeaters. This is how like that tripart distinction works. Other hallmarks of intelligence worth pointing out. This author says that it is axiomatic that intelligence gathering takes place in the context of secrecy. And they say this because otherwise they'll claim intelligence gathering is not distinguished from academic research and market research, etc. In addition, our philosophical readings, the readings I'd assigned, they suggest that truth is ultimate and the appropriate goal for intelligence analysts. We have described intelligence gathering as, after all, seeking justified beliefs, and this is ultimately connected with truth. So it's not entirely weird to say that there's like a relationship between intelligence gathering and truth, of course. I don't always think that this is the case for intelligence gathering myself. I think seeking truth might undermine crucial immediate goals. It might be perfection getting in the way of the good, right? You may just need truth enough beforehand. And a given truth might also be misunderstood when nearby falsehoods are not. So if you're thinking about how you distribute or disseminate the information as part of a cycle, it may be the case that truth is just not what you should be shilling out. So these are just observations on my part, but I will point back to this author. Intelligence is not about truth, they say. We should think of intelligence rather as approximate reality. Intelligence agencies can rarely be assured that even their best and most considered analysis is true. Their goals are intelligence products that are reliable, unbiased, and honest. That's to this author, this is the aim of intelligence gathering. This is what good intelligence looks like. Less about truth, more about reliability, a lack of bias, and honesty, which may or may not align with truth. Hopefully it does, but it gives you a little more flexibility if you're thinking about yourself as an analyst, or you're thinking about yourself going through the process of like laying down constraints on what it would take to generate good intelligence and then turn around and disseminate that good intelligence. Is it true? That might be too high of a barrier to meet. Is it reliable, unbiased, and honest? That seems like a reasonable goal. With that said, let me put to you some putative definitions, which I hope you will attempt to undermine using that if T is true, E is true sort of strategy, that insight there. I say intelligence gathering, given everything we've said, is a planned act aimed at acquiring information to promote the interest of an individual or collective using methods deemed reliable by them. This is a broad characterization of intelligence gathering. It is sort of like an upper definition under which you would create specializations focused on things like an intelligence gathering cycle. This doesn't capture everything in that cycle, but it would be a good start. A planned act is an act in which at least one agent plays a causative role and which is prescribed by some directive information content entity. You can think of that like a plan held by at least one of the agents. And this is just straight out of Common Core ontologies. That's what a planned act is. put aimed at here for a reason, because it doesn't, this intelligence gathering processes, according to this definition, they do not require the information being pursued, in fact, promotes relevant interest. It's just that the directive information content entity, the plan, is directed towards that end. In BFO, processes have happened. If you say this instance, some instance of process falls under intelligence gathering, we have to say that we are committed to saying this thing has happened. So if we wanted to capture an intelligence gathering process that didn't actually acquire information that promoted the interest of an individual or collective, we couldn't call that intelligence gathering unless we had a flexibility by saying it's aimed at. For example, if just to make that more explicit, if I define this as a planned act of acquiring information that promotes the interest of, as a matter of fact, then if I have an intelligence agents or group that goes about and they gather information that ultimately doesn't in fact promote the interest of them, they got, say, bad information or something, they still went through the cycle and it just wasn't as useful as they wanted or thought it would be, I couldn't count that as intelligence gathering, even if they had a plan directed towards that end. But I want to include those sorts of cases. I think that is fine. That's still intelligence gathering. It just misfired, or it was operating on faulty intelligence. It is still intelligence gathering nonetheless. There's a difference between saying that you have gathered intelligence versus you are planning to gather intelligence. This is planning to gather intelligence. I give the broader, more inclusive characterization first, and you specialize from there, rather than starting with the specialization and being like, now how do I get to the broader? It must be constrained by your exploration. The process has to be constrained by the interest of relevant parties using reliable standards. That's characteristic of the intelligence gathering. And then it's broad enough to cover both individuals and groups. And as I was saying here, could be specialized to reflect intelligence cycle planned acts, or indeed covert intelligence gathering, which is, as I described here, intelligence gathering, so subclass. Intelligence gathering that aims to keep information gathering methods and results concealed from all but authorized individuals or collectives. So it has all the characteristics of intelligence gathering with the addition of concealment of both the products and the processes involved.
So it wouldn't make sense to replace everything after the word information with intelligence and then have the definition of intelligence be that, because that's not.
Say that one more time.
So
Everything after
So plan
that
acting
first.
and acquiring intelligence, and then you define intelligence elsewhere as part of that information to promote the interests of an individual.
I could have gone that way, but I think intelligence might be broader than the cycle or the gathering process. And so I wanted to keep them separate, but that leads naturally into the next step. So, because I haven't defined intelligence, as you see, but to get there, here's how I've approached it. Evidence role. It's a role borne by an information content entity whether it justifies or undermines justification in one or more beliefs. Caveat. Neither BFO nor CCL have adopted information content entities bearing roles. This is a tentative proposal. I believe they will. I'm advocating for them to bear roles. Roles, of course, in the BFO sense are things like doctor role, physician role. They're kind of like social, somewhat social, but basically constructed realizable entities that things bear, that those entities may gain or lose without changing anything material about their structure. Information content entities don't have material structure. So there's no worry about them changing when they gain or lose a role. There's also no restriction on roles so far that says they can't be applied to information content entity. It's just not an area that we've researched or explored very much. But it does seem like there are cases like this one where it makes sense to describe information as bearing some sort of role. And as another example, premises and conclusions and arguments. What else would they do but bear roles? If I say God exists, premise, therefore God exists, conclusion, it's the same information content entity. Why are they different? They play different roles in the argument. Information content entity bearing a role. He had to say that real quick. Yeah.
Are rules, if they're constructed, always ascribed?
They're context based, but I don't want to say they're prescribed quite yet.
Okay.
They typically do involve, at least in the standard cases, like they typically provide a lot of social weight or baggage. They have a lot of social context built into it. So you're not going to have like a faculty dean role just pop out of nowhere. So there has to be somebody who's authorizing this and who is justified in doing so. And also you have to be like meeting certain eligibility requirements, etc. Does that make sense?
It does, and I asked because, and I know we haven't really gotten there yet, but
Mhm.
the evidence, it seems like I could ascribe an evidentiary role to
Mhm.
something that didn't actually have it, in the sense of the context actually does not say it is evidence,
Mhm.
but I say it's evidence.
Would you be ascribing it to justify or undermine justification in one or more beliefs?
I think that's.
I'm okay with
I
that.
kind of like this definition in the sense that I think that's evidentiary-ness
Uh-huh.
is that justification. If I feel there's justification, whether or not that's true
Mhm.
is irrelevant to my ascription that it justifies.
Mhm.
So that's where I was trying to think. You can end up with somebody who ascribes the role and yet somebody who also does not ascribe that role
Mhm.
to the same piece of information in the same otherwise context.
Yeah.
But
What does it mean to feel like something undermines justification, but not just undermines justification?
well, I don't necessarily say that everything I feel is actually true.
Oh, I didn't say that. I said undermine justification, not truth. The
Mhm.
world doesn't care about your justification or your beliefs. It's true or not. But justification is built in almost to how you feel about the arguments, how you feel about the beliefs.
I feel like that you could separate what someone knows
Uh-huh.
about justification in a logical sense
Uh-huh.
versus how it affects their behaviors.
Oh yeah, of course.
And that would,
But we're also not talking about that. We're talking about justification.
I think both of those are or require justification.
Maybe we'll see in a second because we're going to discuss a model of cognition. I'll be
Mhm.
curious what you think.
So, the thinking behind it being a role versus like a function, like if you split up the different types of evidence, like it just like evidence that justifies or some sort of defeater, seems like it has more of a function,
Ah,
like a singular.
yeah.
has to be
Functions
used that way.
functions are a subclass in BFO of dispositions. So dispositions are materially grounded. So if you have a disposition, then if some entity has a disposition, it's such that if it were to gain or lose that disposition, something materially about it would have had to change. So and matter is important. That means material object or material entity in BFO has matter as parts. So things that have matter as parts are the things that bear dispositions and functions. Information is a generically dependent continuant, which is a disjoint class from independent continuants, and material entities fall under independent continuants. And so generically dependent continuants are disjoint from material entities, which is to say information doesn't have matter as parts, so can't bear functions.
The role would be the analog.
Yeah. I just walked you through this. But I get what you're saying. There is something functioning going on here. This is one of the things we're working out. It seems like even in an argument.
Position could change if the
Yeah.
information in the evidence change.
Well, if we talk about it more like if we think of it something like a information function, which is a class I just made up for the sake of this conversation, it does seem like there's something analogous going on to the traditional functions that we treat in BFO, where a function in BFO is it exists. So like whatever is the bearer of the function, that's the function is the reason that thing exists. So like a hammer exists to hammer, right? Like there are cases of information that seem like they exist for certain functions, right? Yeah, right. Like exactly. And so like there's something nearby going on. Right now I'm just characterizing these as roles specifically because of that material basis distinction. But this is not to say that there aren't some similarities between functions in the traditional sense, or at least the normative aspect of functions, and then what's going on here with information roles. Again, this is something where this is why I haven't been adopted yet. We've got to work it out, but good eye. Does that make sense? You guys tracking? Covered a lot of info quickly. I'm going to do that again. Evidence. What is evidence? It's just an information content entity that bears an evidence role. Easy peasy. Now, finally, intelligence. Evidence that's the output of intelligence gathering. So, when you get evidence, when it bears a role in justification or support or undermining, when you get intelligence, when you have that evidence or some evidence that's born out of an intelligence gathering process. Go for it, man. I was
So-
hoping you'd have questions.
So then does the. So a planned act aimed at,
Mhm.
to me, implies that may not succeed at it.
That's right.
So if it does not succeed at this,
Mhm.
it seems like you still have, like it's still not succeeding, still falls under the definition of intelligence gathering in
Mhm.
some sense. Does that just mean that like the lack of information kind of then becomes like a undermining piece of evidence essentially? So that even in the absence of a successfully executed planned act, you still gain some sort of evidence that bears on intelligence?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that is sort of how I was thinking. Like, even if you are mistaken,
Yeah.
right? You've got like either bad evidence or you learn this or something, or bad information. You learn this through the process because it doesn't wash out or something. But still you justified or you've undermined justification in some previous beliefs you had, which might count as evidence, probably counts as evidence. It's going to fit into arguments about how you shouldn't be exploring or how you shouldn't be continuing on in the cycle. And that does seem like it's the output of intelligence gathering. So let's run through some cases. Let's think about this carefully. So I want to say that intelligence, what is intelligence? It's the output of intelligence gathering. What is intelligence gathering? Well, you've got a plan to acquire some information that you think will promote the interest of an individual or collective using certain methods that you think are reliable. So there's a plan involved to get some information using methods, and those methods are going to output, you believe, into something useful for your group. Now, evidence, that is to say, an information content entity that justifies or undermines justifications and beliefs you or your group has, that is the output of that process, we'll call intelligence. So think about the collection of this together. You've got an informant. You didn't know they're going to come up to your house at like midnight and they're like, Jack's going to do this thing on the pier.
Right.
You're like, what happens next? Not grab my gun, alert. It's more like, do I trust this person? I've been trained, right? I've been trained in reliable methods, right? Does that make sense? And that methods that are deemed reliable.
Does the thing you have in evidence here,
Mm-hmm.
when it justifies or
Mhm.
undermines, what is that when? What is that what is it doing? Because what I was gonna say is it seems kind of, you could argue with depending on that when,
Mm-hmm.
you could argue that evidence exists in the world
Mm-hmm.
and we discover it, and the when is actually it already justifies or undermines. We just don't, it's an unknown to us that it undermines or justifies.
Yeah, I'm meaning in the sense that goes back to the question I asked you a minute ago, is what is the difference between feeling like it justifies versus it justify?
Right. And
It's very much a social thing, right? Like
Right.
evidence is used in arguments. Arguments are used for persuasion. Who's involved in persuasion? Us.
Mhm.
So there's not a clear line. Like the world is the way it is, but we argue about it.
Right, and that's
Yeah.
why I was thinking about ascription,
Mhm.
because it seems like instead of when it justifies or undermines, which in a metaphysical sense, I could really get into it with you about what that when does, right?
Don't threaten me with a good time.
In a social sense, though, it's when it is used to justify or undermine is sort of what I would tweak it. I understand why it's not there,
Mhm,
but it
mhm.
seems like that's kind of the read as intended, not raw.
Definitely wanted to say, I get the read you're suggesting. I definitely want to say when it does, because I'm not sure when it's used. I'm not sure how to distinguish that, and I think, yeah, they seem the same to me. So, yeah.
So it seems like evidence should bear some similarity to the legal, like the definition of evidence in a legal sense,
Go on.
which doesn't necessarily mean that, like you can enter an evidence. It doesn't mean that it will justify or undermine
Right.
justification. The intent is to try to do that through persuasion,
Mhm.
but there is no guarantee that will or has any bearing on the
Mhm.
facts, the actual facts.
Yeah, I would dispute this characterization of evidence in a legal context. Actually, I have a,
Why wouldn't it work the same way?
was
here?
that, I don't think that's evidence in this sense. Cause it, like, it's entered into, it's more like information.
Because you're trying to, you're aiming at
Mhm.
provable fact versus justified belief.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm aiming at justified belief or undermining beliefs.
Mhm.
But like what's going on there is something like an evidentiary plan or something. I'm entering this
Mhm.
information in the interest of giving you an argument. And what happens when you give the argument, and then it's evidence.
Right.
So I think this is a kind of, to my mind, I may have misspeaking that goes on in law situations. Like I'm entering this as evidence. You don't actually mean here's an argument. You mean here's a thing and I will wrap it in an argument.
Are these from CCO or are these
No,
just?
these are from me.
Oh, it's very similar, by the way.
Yeah. Are they?
They just have active intelligence gathering.
Why do I want to say this is not information gathering, but is in fact intelligence gathering? It's the vetted methods. So this just tells me that the case of like indiscriminate like acquisition of data, for instance, this to me just instead of saying I need to change the label, this tells me I need to address that counterexample because I don't want a three-letter agency just acquiring shoe sizes of people to count as intelligence gathering. I don't actually think that is intelligence gathering. I think it is something more like information gathering, but that's different from intelligence gathering. It's more, I'd rather introduce a parent class that covers that case. This is something more like information gathering that is related to intelligence gathering, but it's not encompassed by it. Yeah.
Could you add like targeted or relevant into the definition?
It's not always targeted though. You could have satellite imagery that's constantly intelligence gathering. It's not targeted at all.
Yeah, I would say that it's not intelligence gathering, it's information, right? Because it's not intelligence until somebody analyzes it or it's
Right.
being collected for a specific reason.
That's right. So this is the distinction I'm trying to draw. And yeah, again, just to go back, I want to capture intelligence gathering as involving a sort of reliable methods output process and to distinguish that from information gathering, which is what's being described here is like just like shoe size gathering and whatnot, or the location of different, I don't know, hospitals in a region randomly. Yeah.
Could you maybe to kind of strengthen the aim, right? After information, define it as intended to be used to promote. That way we kind of put in the fact that like, okay, I'm gathering data indiscriminately, right? I'm not intending to use all that information to promote the interests. So it's information gathering. But then if I go through all that information, gathering other information, which is how I intend to, like, through the lens of my intention to use it to promote the interests. Now it's intelligence.
So CCO qualifies it by gathering information by a government. And then they go on to basically say that it's the guide decisions and actions. So they further qualify it.
Yeah, governments aren't the only things that gather intelligence. Al-Qaeda gathered intelligence. They had methods.
I would agree with you, John, that CCO probably needs to
Yeah,
change this or have subclasses of this.
yeah. This is good though. I would love to belabor this more. But here, let me walk through some highlights of this conversation, which I think was very valuable. One, we got exercise in evaluating or strategizing around how to evaluate definitions of following that, if T is true, then E is true. If E is true, then T is true strategy, which is great. So we had some attempts at coming up with counterexamples that didn't actually work. But then we had some what I think real close counterexamples. Thank you, Mike and Ian. Which suggested to me, I think, faithfully, I'm being honest here, suggests to me that more work needs to be done for this definition. So I appreciate that. And this was a good, productive conversation. For those of you who are listening at home, it's hard. This is how it goes. Okay. And hopefully you've seen some of the nuance of the challenges. What we're aiming for is just as I started with that picture, we're aiming for a general enough definition to cover lots of different types of intelligence and intelligence gathering even, but not so broad as to include just everything. And that's sort of the back and forth we're seeing here. Should we include something like, you know, reasoned thought out outputs of some intelligence cycle aimed at promoting the interest of the US government as intelligence and intelligence gathering? Probably. Should we include like a 3-letter agency just gathering the shoe sizes of a bunch of troops indiscriminately? Probably not intelligence, maybe not even intelligence gathering, right? Good nuance to think through. And does CCO need to be updated? Yeah, I think it's another upshot, which again should illustrate to you how challenging this work is. But also, you know, there's some strategies to pursue. Does all that make sense? I'm going to move on now to cognitive process. So it's not enough, though, to model just intelligence and intelligence gathering. There are people involved. This complicates factors quite a bit. Humans, I don't know if you've noticed, are a little complicated. I remember having this realization when I was driving to go teach some students one day, early in my career. I remember sitting in traffic and looking at all these cars around me and thinking, wow, there are like, at least in this traffic jam, 100 people whose lives are at least as complicated as mine. And then there are billions of people like that. That's incredible. It's a little overwhelming. Humans are complicated. You know we are. Some inroads towards characterizing the human aspect have been accomplished or at least broached by the cognitive process ontology, which is ontology and we can use to reflect aspects of the intelligence cycle, namely aspects like intelligence gathering, new intelligence, cognitive processing, process intelligence, actions, etc. You see intelligence gathering is included here, but also cognitive processing is included here. So what is that? The mental process. It creates, modifies, or has participants some cognitive representation. It can be associated, and often it is, certainly in these cycles, with an investigative process, which is a cognitive process whose agents intend to establish or confirm some portion of reality exists or doesn't exist. Is that true or not? There's also aspects of this intelligence cycle, or just intelligence gathering in general, that involve like representations, beliefs, confidence, targets, stuff we've just kind of been glossing over up until now. I've mentioned belief so many times, right? A representation that is believed is a cognitive representation that's fused with a positive confidence value. What's a cognitive representation? It's a representation in your head. Something like that. More interesting, perhaps. There's a little diagram that might help you see what's going on. So I am investigating information about Taylor Swift. I'm at some concert. I see a singer. She's presented to me as Taylor Swift. I have background beliefs about Tay-Tay. And I make a judgment, that is Taylor Swift, which outputs in beliefs that I see Taylor Swift. Now, of course, I saw Taylor Swift. And now I know I believe I saw Taylor Swift. There's a whole process that goes on that's interconnected with all the sorts of other information that you have in your head about what a Taylor Swift is. Does that make sense? We do this all the time. We just don't think about it. Now you're going to think about it. There's cognitive representations. There's investigative process. There's a representation that is believed. Still, a lot of question marks. I said we're getting closer to the ground, but there are a lot of open-ended questions here. It's complicated. When you're investigating some domain as an ontologist, you should look for what you know, what is represented already, and then what you don't know. When you get to the stuff that you don't know, as complicated as it is, I want you to train yourself to lean in and start modeling things. And here's a way to start modeling things. You boast some explanations. You start providing explanations for what's going on. So right up until now, I've given you some kind of very high level classes. I haven't really explained the cognitive processing and stuff very much, just high level classes about, you know, or some kind of like background information, beliefs that might be born out of it, maybe a gloss or pointing at judgments, but I've not really told you anything about this whole broader process and how it works. You owe that explanation. Without such an explanation, you're just kind of like making stuff up. So let's give an explanation.
I have a question first.
Yeah,
on the last slide.
yeah.
So we talk about the concretization of things a lot, but then we have this cognitive realization, or I forget what you said,
Uh,
and that aren't these. Why don't we have we have cognitive representation, and it
mhm.
wasn't until David built the cognitive process ontology we had this. But why didn't we have the concretization, the act of concretization inside of our larger model before that? Or is it not needed because we know there's a difference between the class and the instance?
So concretization was already in there. So concretization is a relationship between information content entities, or GDCs more generally, and the realizable entities or specifically dependent content entities they depend on. So like the ink inscription, the actual ink, we say it carries an information content entity, which is the same that the information, as to say in the inverse that the information content entity is concretized in the ink pattern. Your mental representations, on one characterization, are qualities of your brain structure, and they carry, i.e., are concretization or concretizing information. I believe that is a dog as information content entity. It's concretized in my brain structure that has certain qualities.
So when Mozart writes a symphony
Mhm.
and concretizes it first in his mind, or
Uh-huh.
he has the representation in his mind first, and
Mhm.
then he puts it on a paper. So it's not concretized until it's concretized with as an information content entity on an information bearing artifact.
So you have the concretization in his head too, right? And
Yeah.
hopefully he intends when he's writing it down to transmit the information content entity that's concretized in his mind over onto the page so that when you pick it up, you get that same information.
But
Now,
isn't that the
successful
same
or not is another
process?
question.
Isn't that the same thing with the process that creates a cognitive representation?
Say that one more time.
Isn't that the same thing as a mental process that creates a cognitive representation?
It maybe what?
So if I'm intelligence gathering, right? And I notice that there's a bad guy at a corner and he's gonna do something bad, right?
Mhm.
I've had a mental process that creates a relationship that says this is a bad guy, we need to go get him. That's a representation, but in actuality, I'm concretizing something that I need to then put into an ICE and then concretize it in a in some type of artifact so that I can tell somebody else to go get the bad guy. Isn't that the same thing?
I mean, it sounds like we're saying the same thing. But like the concretization, observe, like the concretization, you have the information content entity that's concretized in your mental qualities, right? Like the qualities of your brain structure. You have beliefs or whatnot. And then you want to like, let's just take the ink out of this. You want to just say to somebody, hey, this is Taylor Swift. She's a bad
Yeah.
guy. And then like the concretization, like what you are intending to do is and convey to somebody else through the sound wave medium, like the material, like the qualities of the air, like the qualities all the way down. That hopefully is conveying that information into the eardrums of the person listening so that they, in their heads, their material structure is changed such that they now have qualities of the brain that line or that also concretize that is Taylor Swift and she is a bad guy.
I just I feel like the act of concretization or concretizing is so important within ontology.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not something that we specifically call out in an ontology, and therefore, if somebody doesn't work on this from like a educational perspective, they're never going to know what you're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
and that worries me from users or people trying to build ontologies that aren't really ontologists. I don't know.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So if I'm tracking, it sounds like you're saying, or here, I'll pitch it in the way I think I understand. There is a concretization as a matter of fact that goes on,
Yeah.
like as the way the world is, right? And we describe the relationship between generically dependent continuous and specifically dependent continuous as having this as a matter of fact. But then there's also the kind of creation of the concretization, right? Like that relationship,
Yeah.
which is also a matter of fact, but it's different in that there are like agents involved. So you can, and hence the act part, like it's an act of concretization. I'm involved,
Why
engaged,
isn't
in
conversation?
conveying. Yeah.
Oh,
So again,
wouldn't that be helpful if Concord, if it's so important and it is so instrumental to so many things
mhm.
with ICEs, how come concretization isn't an occurrence under BFO?
So concretization, you mean like the class concretization?
Well, I've never seen the class.
Because there is a relation, like concretizes.
Yeah,
Yeah, so there's always that. But I think what you're pointing to is important, like aside from like the structure, right? Like we have, as a matter of fact, concretizations. So we could, for instance, if we wanted to define a defined class of concretizations, we could just say they're anything that's concretized, right? That's straightforward. But the more interesting thing I think you're saying is that there is a distinction between things that are concretized, as a matter of fact, versus things that are like intentionally concretized. Like,
Yeah.
for example, when you're trying to convey information or give testimony about something, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to get you to concretize the same information that I am concretizing.
yeah.
And basically communication. So if you go back a couple of lectures where I talked about the gaps in our ontology development, right? I had some things in red like social acts and language, right? Conventions around it. This is the sort of thing I would think would fall in there. Like, what exactly is going on in terms of information concretization when I am speaking to you now? It seems like that is very important, just as Jay is pointing out. It absolutely is important. Has been underdeveloped. It's one of our gaps.
Because wouldn't you, I could see for information content entity, universal axioms,
Mhm.
some type of concept or act of concretization being applied universally to all ICEs.
I would want to, yeah, no, I think that's true. I suspect one of the reasons this hasn't been explored in much depth is because that seems, even though I've described concretization as like a matter of fact, it seems like they are most often, if not always, involved in some kind of act of concretization.
But like you couldn't have an ICE unless it's been concretized.
Yeah. Yeah. So like that is true. That is absolutely true. His famous example, the one I had in mind was like Hillary Putnam has an article where he talks about ants like following a pheromone path and they happen to draw like make out a picture of Hillary Putnam.
Right.
And then the point of the example is like it's not a picture of Putnam. The ants didn't draw a picture of Putnam.
Right.
I would say the same thing about the Scrabble. But of course the story is a little it's weighed in the wrong way. I think it's not. I think it's easy to not think about the story correctly because it's easy to impose the word meaning on that in that example. So just like it's really easy to see the picture of Putnam. I'm sorry, like a picture of somebody when ants are like crawling around in a certain way.
But it has to be in your mind in some sense for you to be able to recognize the
Right. Yeah. There's got to be a concretization right there. Like, yeah. I think there's still so I think there's still information going on that's concretized in the pattern. I'm not information. I think there's a generically dependent continuant that's concretized in the qualities of the pattern, whether we're involved or not.
Do all
Get
concretizations?
involved. I think when we get involved, we engage in acts of concretization that make it about stuff. So in the example with the Scrabble letters, there's a pattern there, a pattern of symbols that is arranged in a certain way. But I'm not imposing any structure on that. It's just the way symbols are. It's just a pattern out in the world. And then when I come and look at it, it might be about something insofar as I have now engaged in an act of concretization without thinking about it and said in my head, that means dog.
Right.
And I brought a bunch of linguistic aspects to it. And now I've said it's about something, whether it's about a dog or not. If anything, it's about a word. Or it's like reflexively about words or something like that, or language, or a bigger context in which language can be like placed into. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Do concretizations always have to be true?
I mean, well, it depends on what
Here, like the Scrabble example, right?
So,
If I'm John Nash and I have schizophrenia, I might see a word in the Scrabble letters and think that it's a code word from some government project because I have schizophrenia, but that's not real.
Yeah, yeah.
So-
So I'd be disinclined to say that concretizations are true. I'd be more inclined to say that the thing concretized can be evaluated for truth or falsity. Like I can create a logical system about, Alonzo Church actually did this. He created a logical system in which no woman wears a dress as a joke. And the laugh was like, it's of course false, right? Like the current world doesn't match this description. The whole system is an information content entity. It's just not, or I mean, sorry, the whole system is at least a generically dependent continua. It can be concretized in like his chalkboard scribblings or whatnot. Is it true? Absolutely not. But that is it true part is a second step over and above the pattern itself. So you have to add that to it. Or you do add that to it or not. Now, I mean, putting this another way, I'll put this another way. You see patterns out in the world, a face in the clouds. Is that true? Does that make sense? You see like logical connections in a picture. You see Jacques-Louis Davy's picture of Napoleon. You see that one of his hands is slightly bigger than the other. Is that true? What do you mean? Do you mean in the picture? That it's true there's a bigger than relation? Do you mean in the picture in the sense that it relates or is isomorphic to Napoleon? Like, yeah, but I'll note what's going on. I'm like imposing a lot of additional information on top of the evaluation. It's not the image itself, or it's not the pattern itself.
Where
Yeah.
is the thing you're evaluating true or false, or is it the fact that you have that belief?
Yeah, like there's those nuances. Yeah, absolutely. Does that make sense, Jay?
Yeah, I'm wondering if, this kind of thesis kind of thought here. There's some areas here.
Yeah, in that you want to write a dissertation on this?
I don't know.
It's
I-
me.
I think in my naivety, I am thinking that something about active concretization
Mhm.
be required inside of BFO under occurrence, since it's just so intrinsic to almost everything.
I like this idea. I definitely like this idea. I would like to explore more, especially with respect to that dispute that David and I have been having. But I think this is a nice way of characterizing the difference between the positions. So it's active concretization. So it's definitely agential because it's an act. So it's got an act involved, like some agent involved. And they're like, bound, it seems like the paradigm case here is like bound up with communication, like an active concretization. Why am I doing it? I want to convey this information to you. I want to convey some pattern to you and get you to take it up. And I'm wondering if you have such an act, if that is in every case required for generically dependent continuant things or not. I want to say no. But I do want to say that you can have every generically dependent continuant has some concretization. And this is why I'm saying I think it's a good way to distinguish what David and I are saying, because we can have an active concretization, and I'm sorry, you can have just generally, as a matter of fact, concretizations versus acts of concretization.
It's a byproduct of another process.
Yeah,
versus
right.
The intentional process itself.
And you wouldn't have to say that like every concretization is an active concretization or the output of an active concretization or something like that, because that would be false.
But I would say at least every form that is created, right? So every time a carpenter is going to make a table or a sculptor is going to make a sculpture, there's an act of concretization there, right?
I think so.
But, just randomly seeing something in the clouds, you might have concretized a passing thought, but it's not a full-fledged act of concretization.
Right, right. I mean, we could draw these nuance too, yeah. Like in communication is going to be challenging like this. It's going to have this sort of nuance.
I mean, I think as we get into further levels of AI and ML development, these are concepts that systems are going to have to understand the nuance.
Agreed. All right, so what do we have? perceptual encoding of a singer, background beliefs about Tay-Tay, judgment that it is, in fact, Taylor Swift, and outputting as a belief that I see Taylor Swift. We have cognitive representations throughout, an investigative process and a representation that is believed, but a lot of unanswered questions going on nonetheless. It is complicated, but as a rule of thumb, we at least owe explanations, and this is a gap in some of our understanding from an ontologist perspective, but we can start with some narratives or some explanations of what's going on as a way to give us insight into how we should be modeling these question marks. Which leads us naturally to a model of cognition, one that I'm quite fond of. It's sort of rough and ready, but high enough level to at least be true. So what do you have before you constantly? Attention, surrounded by booming and buzzing manifolds of stimuli in your perceptual system, too much to recognize at any given time. William James had pointed this out quite astutely, but it's something that's often overlooked because, well, we focus on things quite a bit. But remember, you're focusing on the chaos. We restrict our attention to some part of the perceptual manifold that we're bombarded with, whether it be visual, auditory, olfactory, etc., any given time. And when we do this, we often ignore other aspects of our perceptual manifold. Suppose I'm looking for cufflinks before leaving for a show, but I can't find them in my drawer. Later on the way to the show, I realized that I in fact did see them in the corner of the drawer, but I didn't recognize that I saw them. Have you ever done this? You saw them, but you didn't see them. You had them in your perceptual manifold. You just didn't judge or recognize or whatnot that you actually did see them, and so you left without them. Or perhaps you were distracted because there was a screaming child saying, "Let's go to the show. I want to see Taylor Swift," on your leg, and you couldn't really concentrate and attend as you needed to recognize. There's an intimate connection between attention and recognition. Nevertheless, you had that encoding. You had that perceptual representation. Encoded information influences beliefs and desires often without your awareness, and some encodings are more inflexible than others. Have you guys seen this Mueller-Lyer? Which line's bigger?
Lies.
Neither. They're the same size. The lines in the center are the same size. It's hard not to see the one in the bottom being longer, though. But if you measured them, you'd see that they're the same size. It's a Mueller-Lyer illusion. Some encodings are more flexible, on the other hand, than others. You see a jazz musician. Now what do you see? Now what do you see? Yes. We're disposed to recognize patterns with these perceptual faculties that we have. For example, the top post on or the Reddit Faces and Things subreddit. Pretty cool. Also, my mother at the top here, DNA, Rosalind's photo 51, fractals, the Pythagorean theorem. We're disposed to recognize these things. We're also, with training, disposed to recognize rather sophisticated patterns and even create them, like music, the Colosseum, a sedan, the internet, crisping technology, patterns. Added to this, we have, in addition to our perceptual manifold and our attention focused on aspects of it, we have memories, some storage system that we use so that we can recall. Some of this is in our work, or the three categorizations that psychologists typically work with are working, short-term, and long-term memory. Working being that what you can do right now on the fly sort of memory. Can you recall several, or the placement of several digits in a line over the course of 2 seconds while you're, I don't know, baking a cake? Working memory. Short-term memory. Can you remember people you just saw 5 minutes ago? Their faces, their names, characteristics of them. Long-term memory. Do you remember what it was like to eat a fly on the floor of your bathroom when you were 2? I do. It's my first memory. Rather than attempt to memorize everything we attend to in our perceptual field, because these are limited faculties we have, we end up naming things and referring to them later. Naming is sort of a divide and conquer heuristic that we have. Language is a tool we use, naming is part of it. It's useful for entities like ourselves with limited memories. It allows us to break down complex information into digestible forms. Here's an example of paint by numbers, which is a great way to teach children how to color things, or large things. It's a divide and conquer. Also, here is a strategy, the grid method that was used during the Renaissance for people when they were trying to learn how to draw images. If you've engaged in any artistic classes at some point, maybe you've learned to do this yourself. Divide and conquer. Naming is like this. I name you Ian, and then I remember that you were distinct from Matthew, this other person. And I can take that information in my head without seeing you, and I can form patterns about the differences between you by referring to the names in my headspace. Terms that carry logical relationships of the sort I was just describing. For example, dog implies a mammal. It's often a pet, typically has a tail. It's not a bird. These are logical relationships, and they carry with them. When did you learn that dogs were mammals? I don't remember learning dogs were mammals. We come equipped with a lot of this. It's habituated into us over time. These conceptual hierarchies, we come with them. We're trained in them through language use and through correction over time. Naming parts of your perceptual manifold to which you attend results in these conceptual hierarchies. That naming goes on either explicitly or implicitly through training or not. Now you're probably doing it intentionally as college students. But a lot of this, as I was saying, happened before you were quote unquote online. Nevertheless, and I think of these as cognitive webs that you have, all these terms and their logical relationships among them. And they're not really webs of belief as you see in some of the philosophical literature like Quine would suggest, but more like interconnected webs of beliefs and desires, knowledge and hopes and wishes, all these attitudes. So not like that web here on your left, but more like that one on the right. What do I mean by these webs? You believe 2 + 2 is 4 and John Beverly is bald, I assume. Disbelieving 2 + 2 = 4 would require disbelieving a lot of other things. More than if you disbelieve John is bald. There's a connection there, right? If you disbelieve that I was bald, you might be thinking to yourself, he's got to be wearing like some kind of like bald hat or something. Like, okay, maybe it's just a really good one. Okay, if you contrast that with disbelieving that 2 + 2 = 4, you've been massively deceived your entire life. So many things have to change. That's what I mean by web. Some of these beliefs are center in that they are depending, or many other things depend on them. Others are peripheral. Other of these beliefs are peripheral insofar as if you were to change them, little bits would have to change, but not everything in the web. So there's like an embeddedness relationship, and that's where the web metaphor is supposed to get traction. Also works with desiring. Assume you desire to live, and no longer desiring that would require changing a lot of other things you desire. Contrast this with if you were to change your desire to not eat peaches anymore. A lot less would have to change if you decided, I don't ever want to eat peaches again. Unless you feel so strongly about peaches that you would die if you never ate a peach, in which case these desires could align. Attention to a portion of your perceptual manifold coupled with naming results in hierarchies of concepts which inform webs of beliefs and desires, and these inform behavior. You reach for a glass of water because you think it's drinkable and your desire to not be thirsty. That's a simple example. Think about, given all I've just said, how complicated that is. Just that simple example that you do all the time. Think about everything that goes into what a glass is, what water is, you believing it's drinkable, you wanting to do it over other things. Imagine how complicated that is, given the little narrative I've just explained. We got to model all that, by the way. Okay, moving on. At least this is, we haven't given an ontological representation of phenomena. Hopefully I've, if anything, just pointed to the complexity of cognition and I will invite you then to take up the task, some of you, and maybe make progress on this. We do not have the space here for this class to provide a model of cognition, partly because it's so freaking complicated. But whatever model of cognition that we develop ontologically will not look dissimilar to what I've just described. It will have all these features in common, and it should have all these features in common. That doesn't really give us an answer to all of the question marks. That helps us understand how we get cognitive representations and what they are. We still don't have a move between the cognition through the judgment. That's where evidence and arguments come in. That's where we get back to evidence. And as I mentioned several times in our discussion, its relationship to argumentation, which brings us to the arguments ontology, which I will discuss next time. Bye.